The Man Who Sold Everything to Buy a Shovel. A story of the California Gold Rush, 1849. The morning Elias Crane sold his last book, the sky above the Ohio Valley was the color of old pewter, and the wind off the river carried the smell of coming snow. He stood in the middle of what had once been his parlor, a room that had held at its peak nearly 400 volumes, and watched a farmer named Hoskins tuck the complete works of William Shakespeare under one thick arm as though it were a fence post. Hoskins paid him 30 cents. Elias took the coins without a word, dropped them into the canvas pouch that was growing heavy now with the small defeats of the last 3 weeks, and turned to face the empty shelves. They were beautiful shelves. He had built them himself, plank by plank, over the course of the summer after he had arrived in Milford to take the position of schoolteacher. That was 7 years ago. He had been 24, fresh from a teacher's college in Philadelphia, full of Latin phrases and opinions about Rousseau, and he had believed, with the sincere and somewhat foolish conviction of young educated men, that a room full of good books was the surest proof that a life was being lived correctly. Now the shelves were bare, and he was 31, and he had $214 in a canvas pouch and a ticket on the next westbound wagon train out of Independence, Missouri. He locked the schoolhouse for the last time on a Thursday. Mrs. Alcott, the seamstress whose 2 boys he had been teaching for 4 years, stood at the edge of the road and watched him walk away. She did not say goodbye. She pressed her lips together and looked at him the way people in small towns look at men who abandon things, with a grief that contains just beneath the surface a thread of contempt. He understood. He had felt the same way himself once about men who left. The road to Independence was frozen in places and muddy in others, and Elias made it in 12 days on a borrowed mule that he sold when he arrived for $11. The town was a carnival of desperate ambition. Every street smelled of leather and horse dung and wood smoke, and men stood in clusters outside the outfitters' shops arguing about the best route through the Rockies and the best method for panning the American River and the best way to preserve beef jerky in dry desert air. They were farmers mostly, and tradesmen, and a scattering of professionals like Elias, who had convinced themselves that their ordinary lives had been preparation for something extraordinary. He bought his place on a wagon train, led by a taciturn Missourian named Gus Pendleton, who wore the same canvas jacket every day and spoke perhaps 40 words per week. The other men in the company were a blacksmith from Kentucky named Tom Stroud, who was massive and gentle and laughed at his own jokes, 2 brothers from Illinois named Cal and Jesse Whitfield, who quarreled constantly and were inseparable, a former Methodist minister named Amos Darby, who had renounced his faith the previous October upon reading a pamphlet about the Sutter's Mill discovery, and had been in a state of spiritual agitation ever since, and a young man of perhaps 19, traveling alone, who gave his name only as Dutch and refused to explain it. Elias was the only one of them who had been a teacher. He discovered quickly that this information produced in the other men a mixture of amusement and mild suspicion, as though his years in a schoolroom were a kind of illness he had recovered from. Tom Stroud clapped him on the shoulder and said he'd heard school teachers were good at keeping records, which might come in useful. Cal Whitfield asked him if he knew anything about assaying gold ore. When Elias said he did not, Cal looked disappointed. Amos Darby asked him if he still believed in God. "I'm not sure," Elias said. "Good answer," said Darby. "Neither am I." The journey west took 4.5 months. Elias had read about the overland route in newspaper accounts and emigrant guides, but reading about a thing and living inside it are separated by a gulf so vast that the word reading can barely describe what happens on one side of it. The plains were not picturesque. They were immense and indifferent, and they stretched ahead of the wagons for days that blurred together until the horizon felt less like a destination than a taunt. The animals suffered. 2 of the oxen died crossing the Platte. A woman in another wagon company, traveling a quarter-mile ahead of them, gave birth in the back of a moving wagon and named the child Nebraska, which Elias thought was either the saddest or the most poetic thing he had ever heard. He kept a journal. He had done this every day of his adult life, and he was not going to stop now simply because he was sleeping in a canvas tent and eating salt pork for the 14th consecutive morning. He wrote about the landscape, which was genuinely astonishing, even when it was brutally uncomfortable. The way the light fell on the Rockies at dawn, turning the snowfields above the tree line a shade of rose pink that had no name in any language he knew, the particular sound the wind made through sagebrush at night, the look on Dutch's face the first time he saw a herd of buffalo, which was the look of a man whose imagination has just been broken open. He wrote about the other men. He wrote sometimes about a woman named Clara Whitmore, who had taught with him in Milford and who had declined, in the gentlest possible terms, his proposal of marriage 2 years before he left. He had thought about her less and less as the planes rolled past, and he noticed this with something between relief and guilt. He also, because he could not help himself, taught things. He taught Dutch to read, a little, in the evenings by firelight, working from a primer he had kept back when he sold everything else. He showed the Whitfield brothers how to calculate distances using compass bearings and the rudiments of surveying, which his own teacher had taught him, and which he had never until now found a use for. He explained to Amos Darby, who asked genuinely and listened carefully, the basic geography of the Sierra Nevada and why the snowpack was so critical to the rivers that had made the gold country possible. "You know a lot of things," Dutch told him one evening. He said it not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation, the way you might remark that a particular horse was tall. "I know a lot of facts," Elias said. "It's not always the same thing." They came down out of the mountains in late August of 1849, and the Sacramento Valley spread below them like a painting of somewhere else. Gold and green and vast in the early morning light, threaded with rivers that caught the sun and threw it back. The men stood at the crest of the last ridge and looked at it without speaking for a long moment. Even Gus Pendleton, whose face had maintained the same expression for 4 months, seemed to experience something. "Well," said Tom Stroud, finally, "there it is." The mining camps along the American River were nothing like the triumphant scenes in the illustrated newspapers back east. They were mud, they were noise and crowding, and the smell of unwashed bodies and the particular desperate energy of places where men are working very hard at something that might not be working. The tents were patched and grimy. The general stores charged prices that seemed designed specifically to transfer whatever gold a man had managed to extract directly back into the pockets of the men who sold him beans and shovels. A meal cost what a week's wages had cost in Ohio. A blanket cost what Elias had once spent on 3 volumes of history. He staked a claim on a stretch of the North Fork with Tom Stroud, who had proved himself, over the course of the journey, to be the most reliable and least dramatic person Elias had ever known. They dug for 6 weeks. The work was brutal, in a way that Elias, who had spent his adult life sitting at desks, found genuinely shocking. Not merely hard, but grinding, a daily assault on the body that accumulated in the joints and the lower back and the hands until he fell asleep each night feeling like a man who had been taken apart and reassembled carelessly. They panned the gravel they dug. They sluiced it through the long wooden boxes the camp had set up along the riverbank. They found gold. Not nothing, not the bonanza, but gold, small quantities that gleamed yellow in the pan and made the heart rise briefly before the mathematics reasserted themselves. After 6 weeks, Elias had recovered his investment and made perhaps $40 above it. At that rate, in a good year, he might make what he had made teaching school, with considerably more physical suffering and considerably less roof over his head. He was not discouraged. He was instead interested. What he had noticed in those 6 weeks and in the weeks that followed was not the gold. It was everything around the gold. It was the organization of human beings under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. It was the way men made rules when there were no rules, the way a community assembled itself out of necessity in places where no community had existed before. The mining camp on the North Fork had, within a year of its founding, developed its own rough legal code. Disputes over claim boundaries were adjudicated by a miners' committee. Theft was punished swiftly and sometimes harshly. A man who helped another man through illness or injury could count on the same help when his own time came. None of this had been designed. All of it had grown. He watched. He wrote. He asked questions. He asked a Chilean miner named Ramos how they extracted silver in the mines of his home country, and Ramos spent 2 hours explaining it to him with drawings in the dirt. He asked an old mountain man who drifted through the camp every few weeks, selling fresh meat and information about the routes through the mountains in winter. He spent an afternoon with a Miwok man named Yolo, who had been brought into the camp by a trader who had decided to use him as an interpreter, with or without his particular enthusiasm for the arrangement, and asked him, through the imperfect medium of the trader's translation, about the rivers and the animals and the names of the places that the Americans had already started to rename. Yolo told him things about the valley that were not in any book. He described the movement of salmon through the rivers in autumn, with a precision and a tenderness that Elias found extraordinary. He described the way the oak trees in this particular valley flowered, 2 weeks earlier than the oak trees 20 miles to the south, and how his people had used this to time the planting of their crops. He described a mountain visible from a certain ridge on clear mornings, whose name meant roughly, the place where the sky learns to be blue. Elias wrote all of it down. He had begun, somewhere in the 2nd month at the camp, to understand what he was actually doing there. The man who changed everything was a child. He was 8 years old, and his name was Will Garrett, and he had arrived at the camp in September with his father, a former Illinois farmer who had sold his land and brought his family, wife, 2 daughters, Will, on the overland trail with the same desperate arithmetic that had brought everyone else. Will's father was not a particularly good miner. He was a slow, methodical man who lacked the gambler's instinct for risk that the best miners seemed to share. But he was patient, and he did not drink heavily, and he cared, with a steady and unconditional devotion, about his family. Elias respected him. Will was something else. He was the kind of child who notices everything, the kind who, at 8 years old, can tell you the exact number of steps from the camp's water barrel to the edge of the claim, who has memorized the names of everyone in the camp and cross-indexed them in his head, by where they slept, and what they ate for breakfast and what they argued about on Saturday nights. He was curious, in the pure and somewhat relentless way that children are, before the world teaches them that curiosity has limits. He had not been in school for 8 months. This was unremarkable by the standards of the camp. Few of the children who had arrived with their families had been in any kind of school since they left home. But Will had clearly had some schooling, and there was a quality to his attention, when Elias found himself explaining something nearby that reminded him powerfully of his best students back in Milford. One afternoon, Will sat down next to Elias while he was writing in his journal, and watched him for a while. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Things I see," Elias said. "Things people tell me. Why?" It was, Elias reflected, the most important question there was, and children asked it constantly, and adults almost never did. "Because I don't want to forget them," he said, "and because someone else might want to know them someday." Will thought about this. "My dad says the only thing worth knowing out here is where the gold is." "Your dad might be right," Elias said. "But I'm not sure the gold is the most interesting thing here." Will looked at him with the direct, mildly skeptical expression that children use when an adult says something that conflicts with everything the adults around them have been saying for months. "What's more interesting than gold?" Elias set down his pen. He looked around the camp, at the rough tents, the wooden sluice boxes, the men bent over the river with their pans, the mountains beyond, the afternoon light slanting across everything in that particular California way that was different from any light he had seen anywhere else. He thought about what Ramos had told him about silver. He thought about what Yolo had said about the mountain where the sky learned to be blue. All of it, he said. He started teaching that October. It began without intention. Will had asked him to explain a word in his journal, and Elias had explained it, and then explained the word's origin, and then the origin of the concept the word named. And 45 minutes later, Will was still sitting there and 3 other children from the camp had drifted over to listen. The next day, Will came back with questions. The day after that, he brought a girl of 10, named Mary, whose family had come from Missouri, and a boy of 6, named Pete, whose father worked the claim 2 sites down from Elias's. By November, Elias was running a school. It was not a school in any official sense. It had no building. It met under a canvas awning stretched between 2 pine trees, which was comfortable enough in the dry California autumn, and became steadily less comfortable as the winter rains arrived. It had no curriculum in the institutional sense, no textbooks, no blackboard. What it had was Elias and his journal, and the accumulated contents of a mind that had spent 7 years reading every book it could find, and another year watching one of the most remarkable human events of the century at close range. He taught reading from a single copy of a San Francisco newspaper that one of the miners had used to wrap a bottle and then discarded. He taught arithmetic, using the actual problems of the camp. If a claim yields $6 a day and a man's supplies cost $2.50, how many days until he can afford a new pair of boots? He taught geography with the mountains themselves as a map. He taught history by asking the men who passed through to tell it. The mountain man told them about the fur trade, and Ramos told them about the silver mines and the politics of Chile, and a former ship's captain named McAllister, who had come overland with a party from New Orleans, told them about the routes around Cape Horn and the economies of the Pacific trade. What he discovered, in those months under the canvas awning with the rain beginning to come down and the children leaning forward on their wooden boxes, was something he had suspected during his years in Milford, but never quite seen clearly. That teaching was not a transaction. It was not the transfer of a fixed quantity of information from a full vessel to an empty one. It was something more like a fire. It required not just fuel, but air. And the air was the questions the children asked, and the curiosity they brought, and the particular angle at which Will Garrett's mind approached a problem, which was never the angle Elias expected, and was always somehow more interesting. He had sold his books. He had not, it turned out, needed them. In the spring of 1850, a letter arrived for Elias from the newly formed California state government, a letter he had not expected, addressed to him by name, which meant that someone had mentioned him to someone who had mentioned him to someone else. The letter was from a committee established to consider the question of public education in the new state. California had passed its first school law in April. The committee needed people who knew something about organizing schools. A man on the committee named Burden had heard through the particular network of gossip and reputation that operated in those pre-telegraph days by a kind of osmosis that there was a former schoolteacher working a claim on the North Fork who had set up a schoolroom under a canvas awning and was teaching 30 children and had ideas worth hearing. Would Mr. Crane be willing to come to Sacramento to discuss the matter? Tom Stroud read the letter over Elias's shoulder and said, "Huh." Elias read it twice. Outside, he could hear Will Garrett arguing with Mary about whether the South American continent was larger or smaller than North America, a debate he had started 2 days ago and had not yet resolved for them, because he found it more useful to let them argue their way toward the answer than to simply provide it. He thought about the $214 he had arrived with. He thought about the book he had started writing in his journal, a book that was not technically a book yet, but that had begun to take on the shape of one, a record of the camp and the people in it and the strange, wild, generous, violent community they had made together out of nothing but desperation and nerve. He thought about the empty shelves in the parlor in Milford and about Mrs. Alcott's expression as he walked away. He thought about what he had come here to find. Then he wrote back to the committee in Sacramento and said yes. He left the claim to Tom Stroud, who was philosophical about it. "You were never really a miner," Stroud said, which was true and kindly meant. Dutch, who had by now learned to read well enough to manage a letter on his own, shook his hand without speaking. Amos Darby, who had found neither gold nor God in California, but had found a kind of gruff contentment that seemed to suit him better than either, said that he thought Elias was making the right choice, and that he hoped he would write. The Garrett family walked him to the edge of camp. Will held out his hand in the formal way of a child who has practiced at being grown up. "Will you come back?" he asked. "I don't know," Elias said, "but I'll send books." He kept that promise. 3 months later, a crate arrived at the North Fork camp, containing 14 volumes, 2 slates, a box of chalk, and a letter addressed to Will Garrett, explaining how to use the surveying formulas Elias had taught him to calculate the height of the mountain, whose name meant the place where the sky learns to be blue. The letter also contained, tucked inside, a single page from a draft manuscript, the first chapter of what would eventually be published in 1853 as Notes Toward a Schoolroom. In the Wild, Education in the California Mining Camps. A book that went through 4 printings and was read by educators across the country and is sometimes, by historians of American education, cited as one of the early documents in the movement toward public schooling in the West. Elias would not have described it that way. He was not, by temperament, a man who spoke in terms of movements and legacies. He was a man who noticed things and wrote them down and tried to teach the people around him to look more carefully at the world they were living in. Whether that was worth more than gold depended, he would have said, on what you needed. But he thought most days that it was. The committee in Sacramento turned out to be a group of men who were genuinely wrestling with one of the great questions that confronted a new state. How do you build a civilization in a place that has arrived, fully adult and furiously busy, without having passed through the usual stages of construction? California, in 1850, had 45,000 people, where 3 years before it had had perhaps 5,000. It had money and ambition and extraordinary natural wealth, and almost no institutions, no courts that anyone trusted, no churches that could keep pace with the population, no schools worth the name outside of the missions that the Mexican government had long since abandoned. The committee needed someone who had actually done it, who had actually stood up in a mining camp with nothing but their wits and tried to teach children something. Elias was, as far as anyone could determine, the closest thing available. He spent 2 years in Sacramento working with the committee. He helped draft the framework for what would become California's first public school system, a framework that was imperfect and provisional and was revised almost immediately. But that established certain principles that mattered: that schools should be free, that attendance should not be conditional on the ability to pay, that teachers should be paid by the state rather than by local subscription, which in the mining camps meant that the schools would survive even when the camps shrank. He argued in committees and in private conversations and eventually in print for the idea that schools in the West would have to be different from schools in the East, not because Western children were different, but because the conditions were, and the curriculum that worked in an Ohio village would not work in a California mining camp where half the children's fathers might be gone by spring, and the children themselves might speak 4 languages and come from 4 continents. He wrote about what he had seen at the North Fork. He wrote about Will Garrett's questions, which had a quality of practical urgency that he had rarely encountered in 20 years of education. Questions born not of classroom abstract curiosity, but of genuine, immediate need. The need to understand a world that was new and that had not prepared anyone adequately for itself. He wrote about the Chilean miner, Ramos, who had more useful knowledge about extracting minerals from rock than any book available in California, and about Yolo, whose knowledge of the local environment was irreplaceable and was being lost daily as the camps expanded and the Miwok people were pushed further from the rivers. He argued that a school in this place should teach what this place knew, not only what the East had codified. Some people agreed with him. Others thought he was being romantic about conditions that were simply deficient, that a good school was a good school wherever it was, and that the task was to replicate excellence rather than invent a new kind of it. These conversations continued for years. They continue in various forms. Still, he did not become famous. He did not become rich. He married a woman named Hannah Adler in 1852. She was the daughter of a German merchant in Sacramento, a reader and an arguer who had opinions about education that were sharper and more radical than his own, and who told him, on the occasion of their third argument about the subject, that she thought he was right about most things but insufficiently willing to make enemies. He took this as a compliment. They had 3 children, all of whom he taught to read before they could walk, or so the family story went. He kept his journal until he was very old. The later volumes are drier, more institutional, minutes of committee meetings, notes on legislation, the careful record-keeping of a man who has learned that the practical matters must be attended to, even when they are not interesting. But occasionally, especially in the first years, the original voice breaks through. The voice of the schoolteacher, who sold his books and bought a shovel and came west looking for gold, and found instead a continent's worth of things he did not know and a life built on the effort to understand them. In one entry, written in the summer of 1851, he describes returning to the North Fork for a visit and finding the camp transformed. Larger, louder, more organized, with a proper general store and a barber shop and even a rough wooden building that someone had labeled, in paint that was already beginning to weather, schoolroom. The canvas awning was gone. The 2 pine trees were still there. He walked down to the river and stood for a while watching the men pan for gold in the afternoon light. He does not say what he thought about. The entry is short, only a paragraph, and ends with an observation that he does not explain or elaborate. The river looks the same as it did the first morning. I am the one who has changed. I think that is the correct order of things. Will Garrett became a surveyor. He worked the California and Nevada territories for 30 years, mapping the land with a precision and a completeness that his contemporaries found remarkable, and he was known to say, when asked how he had learned to read the land the way he did, that a schoolteacher had once taught him to see the distance between 2 points not as an obstacle, but as information. He never fully explained what he meant by this. Those who heard him say it tended to remember it anyway. The mountain, whose name meant the place where the sky learns to be blue, was eventually given another name by the mapmakers. Will Garrett recorded the original name in his survey notes with a careful asterisk and a notation. Local indigenous designation, Miwok, meaning approximately as above. It is a small thing. It is the kind of small thing that costs nothing and matters more than it seems like it should. Elias Crane died in San Francisco in 1891 at the age of 73. The obituary in the Sacramento Union described him as an educator and reformer who had contributed significantly to the development of public schooling in California. It mentioned his book. It mentioned the committee work. It did not mention the mining camp or the canvas awning or the child named Will, who had asked him what was more interesting than gold. He would not have minded. He had never needed to be remembered for the right reasons. He had needed, instead, what he had found. A place where the questions were hard and real, and enough people around him who were willing to try to answer them. He had sold everything to buy a shovel. He had used it to dig, and what he found layered in the ordinary gravel of an ordinary morning, gleaming faintly in the pan. It was not gold. It was better than that. It was something to do.